Today to present the second draft of our unified standard that is out for public consultation. It went out at the end of September and is running through October until November 12th. And so we wanted to bring everyone together today to go through some of the highlights of the standard and let you know where to find information. I think if we go to the next slide, I'll just give a bit more background before we get started on the content. So you can see here that it is about the second draft of the unified standard. What I want to let you know about the webinar participation today, everyone is muted. And so as we go through the content, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. That way, on the back end, we can be sorting through those questions. Some of them we may be able to respond to in the moment in writing if it's something fairly quick and simple. But we do plan to go through most of the Q&A at the end of the information that we want to present to you. So just stay tuned for that. We want to make sure that we share out the responses. If there are a lot of questions and we're not able to get through everything, then we will be providing more information after the webinar. The other thing that I want to let everybody know is that this is being recorded, and we will share a recording afterwards. As long as you've signed up to receive our communications, then you will get that recording. Also, the slides will be provided. And we do have a lot of content, so that means in some cases we're not going to be going through all of the points on the slide. So if you see that there was more information that you wanted to know about, you have access to those afterwards. And I believe that's everything that I wanted to kick us off with. You can see here who's going to be talking to you today about different parts of the update information that we want to share. So we'll just start going through, and I'm going to hand over to Trini.
Thank you, Laura, and hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm going to tell you a little bit about background information and why a unified standard system. So we currently maintain 8 different standards, and in about 2021, we, together with the Climate Plus strategy, the emergence of our Climate Plus strategy, we decided that it would be best to unify the current suite of standards that we have, the 8 different standards, into a more harmonized system. And that was also a huge opportunity to embed the Climate Plus strategy and other key impact outcomes into our standard system. So when we go to the next slide, we see a little bit more about what the future state of standards will look like, or the future state of the unified standard. And the unified standard right now is a placeholder name. We will be mentioning or revealing the ultimate name of the standard later down the line. So no, for now, that is a placeholder name. We are looking at the tier 4 level and first processing level for the unified standard. So it is a raw material standard that will focus on natural fibers, animal fibers, MMCF, which stands for man-made cellulosic fibers. It also contains recycled, including synthetics and MMCF, as well as biosynthetics. And then the chain of custody will continue to remain from source to brand. So the tracking, the handling, and the volume reconciliation will continue. For some, it will be optional modules for some areas. It will be optional modules in tiers 1, 2, and 3. If we go to the next slide, we see a little bit more about the scope of the unified standard. So as you had seen on the previous slide on the materials and the fibers that will be included, here is a little bit of a different presentation on what will be included in the unified standard directly versus what will be included via a recognition model. And Laura is going to share a little bit more about the recognition model later today. So you will see that natural fibers, fiber crops, cotton will be handled via recognition model. Recycling, including synthetics, will be handled direct. We have GRS today and RCS today, so we do own 2 recycled standards. Animal fibers and materials, where we have our responsible animal fiber standards, wool, alpaca, mohair, and down, will be handled directly. And cashmere, for cashmere, we're looking at a recognition model as well. Man-made cellulosic fibers, we're looking at a recognition models for MMCF, and same for biosynthetics and biomaterials. So now let's look at the scope and timeline a little bit more. We have released, if you have followed along the development process, the first draft of the Unified Standard earlier this year for public consultation, and it was open for 60 days between May and July. And we are releasing the draft version in stages. We're now at the second draft of the public consultation that just launched September 27th and will be open until November 12th. And on this slide, you see the evolution of content that was included in the different draft versions. So the one that is out for public consultation now contains new information, additional information, more fleshed out information, and refined feedback from feedback we had received on draft 1. We also have included monitoring, evaluation, and learning indicators, and also put our thinking forward regarding additional policies, as well as the supply chain modules that will be optional for, in some areas, for tiers 1, 2, and 3. And then Laura is also going to talk to us more about the recognition framework later. In Q1 2024, so early next year, we're looking to release a planning version of the Unified Standard, which will include feedback that we have received on the current version that's out for public consultation, and also build out the additional areas to finalize some of our thinking. And I am going to go over the timeline a little bit in the next slide. So we also see, what does 2024 actually look like in terms of implementation. So if we go to the next slide, you see right now in the upcoming milestones, we are in Q4 of this year. So the second draft is out for public consultation. Content will be refined as we head into the new year, and we are releasing the planning version of the Unified Standard. 2024 is what we mark the year of implementation, where we are preparing supplementary document and all associated documents that go with a standard system. And we're also running various pilots on the Unified Standard to make sure that what we have developed is really sound and is working in the field, and to gather more learnings on the proper and the best implementation. 2025 is the year where our current suite of standards and the Unified Standard will exist in parallel. So in 2025 is the first year where auditing may begin to the Unified Standard, but it can also still happen to the current suite of standards. In 2026, however, the Unified Standard will become mandatory for everyone. So the current suite of standards will be phased out, and the Unified Standard will be the standard that everybody will have to certify to. And I believe that is it. So I'm now handing back to Laura for some general updates around architecture and changes in draft 2.
Great. Thank you, Trini. So yeah, I'm going to walk us through some of the higher level changes that have happened that you should expect to see, but then I will give a few of the more specific material related changes that have happened, so that it will help you, guide you to where you may want to dig into some of those details in the draft standard. So if we go to the next slide, I will just show you here how the sections of criteria are divided within the standard. So when you open the document, this is where you can choose which criteria you might want to be focusing your attention, depending on the material that you're interested in or the particular area. So for human rights and livelihoods, for example, or if you're interested specifically in chemical management at a processing facility, this will help guide you. And if you're looking at the Excel version, there are instructions about how you can go through and choose the right filters to get to the sections that you would like to see. Some of these sections have been updated, and I'll walk you through some of those changes further down. So if we go next. I also want to make sure everybody is aware of the type of criteria to be on the lookout in the standard. So each criterion has a designation. First, whether it is conformance related or leadership. Conformance means that it is specifically evaluated by the auditor during the audits to check level of conformance and whether it's marked as yes, there is conformance, or no, which would result in a non-conformity being issued. And so conformance related is what determines the final certification decision for each organization, whereas the leadership criteria really function as recommendations for those of you familiar with our standards today. In the case of the unified standard, what the leadership criteria are doing is giving an indication of the direction that we would like to see organizations moving in. And that means it gives us an opportunity to test how those criteria may work on the ground and understand and learn more about them, and then make a decision in future versions of the standards if leadership criteria will move into the conformance category. So as you look at the criteria, it's really important to check if it's conformance or leadership, because I know in some cases it can throw people off if you feel that this is really robust in terms of what's being required here, and then you would see that maybe it's already categorized as leadership. The other thing to be aware of is that within the existing criteria, both for conformance and leadership, we've tagged some of those as monitoring, evaluation, and learning indicators. You'll see them as MEL indicators. And I am going to talk about what that means a bit further down, so I'll wait until then. But the last bit of information on this slide is the performance determination. Because we've prepared the draft standard in an Excel file in columns, that means you will see performance determination information that's lined up with each criterion. That provides insight to the certified organization as well as the auditor in terms of how a particular criterion is intended to be met and evaluated. So it's helping to bring consistency to the audit process. It also allows us to provide more information about smallholders versus other size organizations, and if there's any difference in how the criterion is evaluated for smallholders. And then going next. So before I get into the more specific details for the different materials, I want to make sure everybody is aware of this key information. Trini already ran us through the current timeline that we're in and the public consultation running through the 12th of November. And also we'll talk about the summary papers that we have available to support the content in the standard. But that is important information to be aware of that's posted on our website. In terms of more of the headline information for changes that we've made in the second draft, we are going to go through some of these in more detail, but I just want to make sure at a summary level, people are aware that in the first draft, we had farm level cotton production criteria in our land use section of the standard. Those are no longer in the standard because in between the first draft and the second draft, we've made a decision to move towards recognition partnerships where we will work with other standard organizations at the farm level. So we'll give more details about what that means a bit later. Other criteria that have been removed since the first draft of the standard are for yak, for animal fibers, as well as latex. So if those were materials that you were particularly interested in, just it's good for you to be aware that you're not going to see those in the second draft of the standard. The reason for that is just what we've determined are the areas that we really need to focus our time and energy right now on getting the first version of the standard out for everybody to prepare against. Also, we've taken a deeper dive on man-made cellulosic fibers. So there are additional criteria specific to MMCF that have been added. And then we'll talk about the MEL indicators a bit later. The other important information on this slide is about the supplementary draft documentation that we are planning to provide. This is information that is not specifically represented in the criteria. So we determined that for organizations that are impacted by these areas, it is still important information to provide an opportunity to read earlier on in our development phase, so to be able to have access to those drafts and provide feedback. The first is about our recognition concept, where we'll work with other standard organizations, and that's what I'll talk a bit more about later. As well as voluntary supply chain modules and our concept for how we'll capture additional verification data for the rest of the supply chain tiers 1 through 3. We also are making an update to the farm questions that currently exist today for the animal fiber as well as the down standard. So we've been looking at those in the context of impact information and data that we would like to collect to monitor progress on the standard. So we want to make sure and provide that draft updated questionnaire out to stakeholders to be able to view that. And then the last supplementary draft document that we plan to provide is where we've been looking at the feedstock eligibility for our recycled materials. We've been taking a look at the definitions for post and pre-consumer and adding clarification language to the definitions that we're using to help bring consistency to that interpretation. So on the next slide, this is where I am going to get into more details on the materials, but you can see there's a lot of information here that I'm not going to be able to talk through all of this in the time that we have. So please do come back to the slides after we share them, and or really this information can be found in the summary papers that are posted on the same webpage as the draft standard. So you can get a lot more detailed information there. But in terms of the highlights for what's happened with the criteria specific to animal materials, I talked about the monitoring and evaluation indicators and that we're making an update to the farm questionnaire. We've also tagged criteria within the standard that may be used for that measurement process that we have in place for understanding the performance and effectiveness of the standard. Cashmere is a fiber that we are interested in including in the unified standard in the future, but we don't intend to be developing criteria at the farm and herding level for cashmere, but looking at opportunities to work with pre-existing standards that are already working on the ground. For human rights and livelihoods, we've looked at introducing a definition for what constitutes a smallholder or a farm that is defined as small. So that is an important bit of information to be on the lookout for in the draft standard in terms of what is that definition of a small farm, so that then you can tie it to where in the performance determination for animal materials we've given that designation in terms of criteria may be evaluated in a different way based on smallholders. So that is important information to be on the lookout for, and something that we really do want to hear feedback because it's quite challenging to determine what is the right definition for a smallholder when you're talking about the globe and many different types of operations in animal materials. And then let's see, the processing facility section. So the last highlight that I'll give on this slide is something that's important for people to be aware of because of the scope of the unified standard. When we talk about the climate plus impact areas, and the criteria that we've been working on that tie to measuring outcomes at both the farm level as well as first processing. That means for animal materials, as they move into that first stage of processing, we also have facility level requirements that cover areas like chemical management and the discharge of waste. So it's important to take a look at the processing facility section in the Unified Standard if that's an area that is applicable to your organization, to understand those type of new criteria. So let's go to the next category, which is recycled materials. So again, I'm going to just give the highlights. The way to find the criteria specifically applicable to manufacturing in a recycled context is in the processing facility section. This has updated criteria for chemical management, water use, discharge of waste, and those different environmental areas. So those are important to be on the lookout for. Something to be aware of is that we have understood via the implementation of the GRS today that there have been challenges for certain types of recycled materials where there are chemicals that are used inherently at the very beginning of the supply chain that may be restricted based on requirements that were designed for the end of the supply chain. So we've taken a much closer examination of those types of chemicals and what has been restricted today in our standard and how to address that in the scope of the Unified Standard, which is at the very beginning of the manufacturing process. So that's important information to be on the lookout for, and a lot more detail about what's happened is included in the summary paper for recycled materials. Another important area to be on the lookout for is human rights and livelihoods. The GRS includes a social module today, but we've taken a shift in terms of how we're looking at criteria related to human rights and livelihoods. So reviewing that information and understanding the applicability of those criteria for recycled processing facilities is another important area. I talked about related policies already, that we have a plan to provide out a draft document on how we're taking another look at how we've defined pre-consumer and post-consumer waste, and then what is the review and approval process that we have in place for what we accept into our recycled material category. The other last important point I want to mention related to recycled materials and the GRS, when the modules that we have today, such as the chemical module and the social module, those are evaluated throughout the entire supply chain. So not just at the beginning of the manufacturing stages like we have covered in the scope of the Unified Standard. But what we are proposing to do is shift to a voluntary supply chain module concept where organizations that are participating in the content claim standard certification for the Unified Standard material to be tracked through their manufacturing and other facilities, that if those organizations have verification for other environmental or social related areas, providing a system to capture that information into our shared measurement system so that we can record all of the different attributes related to materials in one place and have that consolidated for viewing by the certified organizations as well as brands at the end of the supply chain. So that is a concept paper that we're putting together and will provide out for review as well in the coming weeks. For MMCF, the main thing to be aware of is that what I mentioned earlier, that we've taken another closer examination at the type of chemical requirements and waste discharge requirements that have been in place in the GRS today, and how to adapt those in a meaningful context for MMCF manufacturing at the pulp stage. We're continuing to work with ZDHC, so we do reference their MMCF guidelines. They're working on another version, an updated version of those guidelines. So that's information that we plan to work closely with ZDHC and capture in the unified standard in the future. So it's important to be aware of that development and to look at the changes in criteria in the second draft. The other important bit about MMCF is that today in our standards, we're capturing recycled MMCF, but there is virgin-based woody biomass as a feedstock as well. So we want to look at opportunities for recognition of that type of input for MMCF. And let's go. I'm going to hand over to Christina Irado for talking about what we've been doing with cotton in the standard.
Thank you, Laura. Hi, everyone. So for a quick background, just a quick reminder that the fiber crops module is what you all might have seen in draft 1. We used to refer to it as the fiber crops module. And this is because the original scope of the unified standard was for cotton, hemp, and flax. But we did decide that as we got started on the development of the criteria, that we really wanted to focus on cotton as the major material category. And so you might also recall that in draft 1, we explained that there was a desire to integrate fiber crops production criteria into the unified standard at the farm level. This is because this is an existing gap in our standards, and we want to make sure to consider all materials for alignment in our Climate Plus strategy in the unified standard system, the future system. And so as we were developing this, we were considering both certification within our own system, and also we were considering recognition as options. And so as Laura and Trini have both shared with you all prior, we have decided to focus on recognition partnerships moving forward in order to integrate farm level, in order to work with farm level cotton standards and programs and bring their certified material as eligible cotton feedstocks into our system. So we're hoping that through a recognition process, we can bring their eligible cotton feedstocks into our system at the facility level. So this means that what you'll see in draft 2 is, again, as Trini has shared, we have, and Laura, we have removed farm level criteria for cotton from the land use section, but you will see lint cotton processing or ginning criteria for the facility level are retained in draft 2. So we don't want to confuse anyone. Again, the reason for that is we want to accept the eligible cotton feedstocks into our system at the facility level. And what we will do is we'll take the revisions and the feedback given through the draft 1 public consultation process. We have actually, because a lot of the criteria are cross-referenced or shared with the animal fibers for land use in the land use section, we actually, you'll see some of those land use criteria changes reflected there, even though they're not tagged for cotton. But we're also going to take the feedback that was given and use it in order to develop the recognition framework. So again, we really appreciated your feedback, and it will be continued to be used. And also later on, for the, again, as we mentioned, the scope is now only for version 1 is for recognition for cotton. And in later versions of the standard, we do hope to revisit opportunities for other fiber crops. And so the next major highlight is that we wanted to share that the organic content standard will be continuing on as a standalone standard. We were hearing lots of confusion about the OCS and organic in the unified standard system, and we know that the confusion was also because we were going through our own internal review process and exploring options for what we wanted to do with the organic content standard and how it was going to be integrated into the system. And so again, for some background information, the organic content standard was created with the goal to increase organic agriculture production and provide farmers with access to the market. We see this as a really valuable niche, and we will continue to be promoting this in the future system. It'll just be as a standalone standard in parallel to the unified standard. And so this means we'll continue to accept national organic standards operating at the farm level that are iPhone family, that are encased in the iPhone family of standards. And we are also planning a revision in the upcoming months in order to enhance its integrity and relevancy in a changing environment. And so just to recap what I've shared, here is a visualization. The takeaway here is that moving forward, there are two pathways for cotton. One that is specific to sustainable and preferred cotton through recognition, and well, both are going to be related to recognition in some form. Again, number one being the sustainable preferred cotton through a recognition system or recognition program for the unified standard, and again, organic production through the organic content standard is maintained. And back to Laura.
Thank you, Christina. So I'm realizing the time that we have, we're getting some good questions and we want to make sure we have that time at the end. So some of the next couple slides I'll go through a bit more quickly. What I want people to be aware of with the human rights and livelihoods part of the standard is that we are shifting our focus on looking at a risk-based approach. So organizations would prepare their systems and due diligence mechanism based on the risks that they have within their particular operations, the part of the world that they're in, the materials they're working in. So it will be much more context related in terms of what we expect to see. And then audit processes will more focus on how the due diligence mechanisms are being implemented and the effectiveness of the system as a whole. The other thing I want to mention about human rights and livelihoods that's important for everybody to be aware of is this is another of those impact areas that we're not just looking at it at the tier 4 farm level, but also moving into the first processing. So the scope of the standard covering the pre-spinning processing. So there are going to be some facilities that are certified today that are not necessarily evaluated against social criteria, but will have the human rights criteria applicable in the future. So it's an important part of the standard to be reviewing with that information in mind. And then if we continue, we mentioned before that what is the new content in the second draft of the standard. The chain of custody section is part of that. Chain of custody is applicable anytime that there is a risk of material being mixed, but also in terms of volume reconciliation. So any organization that is certified that is selling certified materials will need to have a certain basic level of chain of custody in place. So we've introduced those criteria. An important aspect of this is in the standard, there are several criteria that lay out the applicability of chain of custody, and in particular, letting organizations know which type of operations will still be required to have a full CCS audit and certificate for our content claim standard. So that really is all processing facilities that will need to still move forward with the content claim certification. We also have logo use and claims criteria included. So any organizations that are planning to make claims about their certified materials, there are some basic level criteria in the standard for that as well. I already talked about the voluntary supply chain modules and that's a concept we are planning to introduce, but we'll be providing a draft document in the meantime to let people know what that proposal looks like so that we can get your feedback about that. And if we go, so the monitoring, evaluation, and learning indicators, I've been talking about these a bit. This is information to provide more clarity on what we mean. Essentially, it's a process where we need to be measuring our progress on the desired outcomes that we have defined related to the standard as a whole. So what is the change that we expect to see on the ground based on introducing a standard and a set of criteria that are focused on responsible practices? It's also very specifically tied to our Climate Plus goal, and that we've defined desired outcomes and aligned with targets related to that goal. So we need to also look at opportunities for the type of data and information that we can be collecting as part of an audit process to be able to measure progress and see if we are on the right track via standards as well as within the industry as a whole. So this is a work in progress, and it's something that we will be testing in 2024. So right now, what people can expect to see are criteria that have a certain measurement component tied to them. We've tagged them as MEL indicators. It doesn't mean that we are going to specifically collect, ingest, and measure all of those type of criteria, but we wanted to provide an indication of which ones we may want to be collecting. And that's why it's important to get feedback from stakeholders about what you think are going to be the most important points of information for us to be inputting into that type of monitoring and evaluation system. Then if we go, let's see what's next in the slides. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about our recognition framework. And if we go to the next slide, it provides a high-level definition of what we mean when we talk about recognition. This definition is far-ranging because there are so many different forms that recognition may take in our future standard system. So ultimately, it is really about forming partnerships between different standard organizations and looking at ways that we can collaborate on the systems that we are providing to the industry via standards. And that is to help reduce duplication of our efforts and actually come and work together, and therefore just have a much more efficient way to be driving beneficial impacts on the ground faster. And so in the next slide, this provides some of the clarity on the ways that we're looking to work with other standard organizations and recognize the work that they've already been doing on the ground. So on the left side, these are the different materials that we know there are already certification standard systems in place, and that we want to look at being able to work with them, check our alignment on the direction of travel that we have with our Climate Plus goal, and measuring outcomes for understanding the progress that we're making. So we would go through an evaluation process for those standards related to these materials in order to determine if those certified materials can be considered as eligible inputs at the processing facility level and into the rest of the supply chain as part of the unified standard scope. On the right side of the screen are impact areas that we have criteria. Most of those we have criteria in the unified standard that we've been developing, but we're aware that there are other verification programs that exist with specialists in these areas. So typically verification systems that specifically focus on human rights or on chemical use. And we want to look at opportunities at how we can work with those organizations in order to accept the verification data based on audits that are happening to their criteria and have that replace the duplicate type of audit that would happen for the unified standard with our certification bodies. So it's a way that we can have a specified type of recognition to accept those audits that are already happening on the ground and help reduce the time and cost to the audits in our system. I believe the next slide is just to provide a bit more information about why we're looking at recognition, because this is quite an intensive process to build out and go through those type of evaluations with other standards and setting up those type of partnership agreements with them. But ultimately, it is about creating positive change on the ground, and that if we come in and introduce duplicate type criteria and audit processes, it means that we would be adding to the proliferation of standards and audits that need to happen. That adds to the cost and effort of the certified organizations to have to manage multiple certificates and audit processes, and therefore really distracts from the changes that need to be happening on the ground. So we really would prefer to drive those beneficial impacts faster by working through partnerships with other organizations that are already offering standards and certification for those same areas that we feel are important for the unified standard. And I believe this is where I am going to hand over to Stephanie Pokorski to walk you through what we've been doing on claims and labeling.
Sure, thanks, Laura. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight a few of the key activities that have been happening on the claims and labeling side for the unified standard. The first is the branding project that we've been working on for the past year and a half or so. As most of you know, the unified standard is not the official name of the standard that will be released next year, but we are actually coming up or have already come up with a new standard name, a new logo, and we'll have a new labeling system that is intended to represent the different materials that are in scope of the unified standard. So the new brand and the new labels will be replacing the current ones for all standards in our system right now, except for the OCS, as Christina just shared, will be existing in parallel with the unified standard, and the CCS, which also will not be updated in the unified standard system and does not have a labeling option attached to it. We're also will be working on an updated claims and labeling system all throughout 2024. So we will actually be conducting a revision of the current claims policy and updating it to suit the unified standard. We have a labeling task force, which is a little bit like the international working group that worked on the standard, but they're focusing on the claims and labeling side of things. They have fed into the branding process as well, helped us decide the new name, the new logo and label designs already. We'll also be working with relevant stakeholders and consultants where needed to make sure that we're creating criteria and policy that works for everyone. So all of this documentation related to the claims policy will be released alongside the unified standard becoming effective in 2025. And of course, the intention of this policy is to provide guidance for companies to communicate about the standard and the different materials and scope of it. And then lastly, with regard to legislation and all the changes happening there, we are definitely looking at this very closely. Our Climate Plus team actually leads on the policy and legislation engagement, but from the claims side, we are also supporting with relevant information and understanding the context and how it affects our standard system and the claims that will allow in it. So we've been engaging with a lot of different stakeholders and groups to make sure that we align with this legislation that's coming out, particularly in the EU around green claims and preventing greenwashing. And when it comes to the claims policy and the new labels, the allowed language that will be presented for the unified standard, we do plan to have a full legal review of all of that done according to the new legislation, to make sure that we are creating something that will be as close to compliant or compliant with the legislation from our end. You can go to the next slide. And then just a quick look at the timeline alongside the unified standard. So Laura already shared, or Trini shared, the timeline for the unified standard, releasing the planning version in Q1 of 2024. You can see on the bottom from the claims policy and labeling system side of things, we're on a slightly different track. We do plan to share the official name of the unified standard and the new logo, so that new brand I was speaking about. We will be sharing that in Q1 of 2024 alongside the release of the planning version of the standard. But throughout 2024, that year of implementation, we will also be working on the claims policy revision and going through those series of different legal reviews, a public consultation to get feedback from stakeholders, et cetera, with the intention to have everything wrapped up and available for use in early 2025 when the standard becomes effective. I'll just note here as well that we'll have a transition period, of course. So there will be a period of time after 2025 where the old logos will coexist with the new logo for the unified standard, but they will transition or phase out over the course of at least 1 year. It could be longer, or we may determine different materials will phase out at different times over the course of a 1 to 2 year period. So throughout 2026, the transition will be happening, and we will be sure to prepare everybody with the information and the resources they need to transition to the new logos and the new claims in the unified standard system. And that's all from my end. Thank you.
Excellent. So I am going to, in the next minute, quickly share how you can participate in the public consultation. So as I mentioned earlier, the second draft of the unified standard is now out, has been out since September 27th and is out until November 12th for public consultation. And you will see in the next slide, if we switch to the next slide, there are different ways to participate. So Asa has already shared the most important link that holds all information in the chat window, which is the first link that you see here. And you can share your feedback in multiple different ways. So there is an Excel version of the second draft of the unified standard and a PDF version. You can comment in the Excel version offline, track your comments, fill out who you are, and email it back to standards@textileexchange.org. Or you can also track your comments if you open the JotForm link and track your comments there via an online platform by looking at either the Excel or the PDF alongside your review. And then I also want to highlight that we have various supplementary documents available. When we go to the next slide, you see a few screenshots of what you are going to see on our website. So there are summary papers that will help you navigate the second draft of the unified standard. And also there are different links and different ways to get to the materials, namely the standard itself, the online feedback form. So be sure to visit the website. And with that, I think we are going to open our Q&A session.
Great, thank you, Trini. So we're going to go through the questions that have gone through so far. The first one, I will direct it to Laura Kohler. What is the definition of biomaterials?
Yeah, thank you, Claudio. So biomaterials are a natural material that is typically coming from agriculture production. Sometimes it's directly from the crop that's harvested, and other times it may be the residue that is left over after harvesting. So for example, with sugarcane and the waste material that's left on the fields after what's needed for processing sugar has been harvested. And those materials are able to be processed into textile related fiber. And so in that case, we're categorizing them as biosynthetics. So the way that I like to think of it is biomaterial is the feedstock, and then the fiber that's coming out of production of that feedstock is utilized as a biosynthetic. And so we are looking at opportunities to partner with other standards that are working at that farm level or just on the ground in terms of that raw material management. But then because that type of feedstock can be used in a wide variety of industries, we want to make sure that we're able to capture it in the infrastructure that we've set up for the textile industry in terms of the processing facilities. Before we go to the next question, I just want to make sure people understand the screen we're going to leave up for you is so you can see sessions that we have coming up at our annual conference in London so that you can take note of standard specific sessions that we have. But yeah, let's continue with questions.
Great. Thank you, Laura. The next question comes from Sabrina Frontini. Hello, are leathers, hides, and skins included in the animal fiber analysis?
So skins are included for the animals that we have also included in the unified standard. So for sheep and mohair, alpaca. So in processing of those animals, there may be the result of having skins that is an option for those farms to be able to sell as certified. We don't today have leather coming from cattle. That's something that we're working on in a separate program for our Leather Impact Accelerator, and something we'll look at being able to include in the unified standard in the future, but not at this time.
Great, thank you. The next question is from Patrick Chan. In the summary paper, draft 2, recycled materials, there was a text under related policies in page 7. There are requirements areas specific to recycled materials that are being revisited, specifically around minor adjustments to the definitions for inputs accepted as either pre-consumer, post-consumer, and reclaim, as well as the feedstock eligibility review and approval process. The question is combined noil, which is waste generated in combing, yarn, and spinning, being included in this review? Can it be regarded as a sustainable material? If not, why?
So I won't be able to answer this completely right now. What I want to let you know is that the work we've been doing on the definitions is not really changing what has or has not been accepted today. It's trying to bring clarity to the definitions that we have aligned with ISO on pre-consumer and post-consumer. I have, because of recent conversations, been made aware of the topic around noils. And so separately from what we've been working on for the draft definitions that we want to provide out, there are more conversations to be had about noils so that we can learn more. So it's not something that we're going to be able to address in the draft document right now, but something that we have been made aware of and are going to be taking a closer examination to understand the specific aspects of how noils are generated and how those may be captured in our standard. So more information to come on that.
Another question to Laura. Will we see the updates to the farmer questionnaire as part of the version 2 of the draft in regard to additional MEL being added?
The answer is yes and no. So definitely we will be providing the draft farm questionnaire out for review. We don't have a specific date right now for when that will be provided. Ideally, it will come out during the same period of time that we have this second draft consultation open. So meaning before the 12th of November, but we will be providing any of the additional draft documents that I had mentioned. We'll be making those available for a period of time that's longer than the actual draft criteria are open for consultation. Because those are works in progress, it works within our system to be able to provide those for a longer period of time. So hopefully within the next couple of weeks, we'll be able to provide that and make sure everybody is aware that they're available for review.
Great. This question is directed to Callie Weldon from Cassidy Survey. For brand level, do we need to have both the unified and cotton claim standard in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you can think of the unified standard system as the same as our current individual scopes. So brands who are certified to the content claim standard, they'll have a CCS scope certificate with the various input scopes listed on their certification. So you could be brand certified to the CCS with an RDS scope. And so in the future, that will remain the same. Brands don't need to have additional audits. The chain of custody, for the most part, will remain the same. There will be updates so that the system is amicable with the unified standard, but your CCS scope certificate will just have the adjusted scopes of the new unified standard system listed on your certification. So brands who are certified are in a good place to be set up to receive the new unified standard certified material flowing through their supply chain and be able to make claims on it in the future when the standard's effective.
Great. Thank you, Callie. We have another question regarding recognition from Patrick Chan. Under the recognition model, several materials were mentioned, including cotton, MMCF, cashmere, and biosynthetics. What organizations or parties or partnership are you referring to? Over to you, Laura.
Yeah, so when we talk about being able to recognize certified raw material inputs, such as cotton or feedstocks for MMCF, we're looking at other standard organizations and the criteria that they've developed for that raw material management. So an example would be if we're talking about woody biomass for MMCF, everybody should be aware of that there's both the Forest Stewardship Council and the PEFC standards that exist. So those are organizations that we would be looking at opportunities for recognition. So I'm just giving examples because obviously there is still a lot of work to do for any of these raw materials where we need to make sure we have clearly defined the type of criteria and other type of assurance systems in place with those standard organizations, go through an evaluation process, work with those organizations to determine if we can set up a partnership agreement. So there would still be a lot of work to do before we make any final determinations on those other standards, but that should help by just giving a couple examples.
Thank you, Laura. Here we have a question with Lisa that asks for some clarity around how we define MMCF, as it's mentioned that MMCF can use both wood and biomaterial. Can you explain this because it sounds a little bit confusing?
So today, MMCF that is certified in our standards is in the recycled category, so coming from recycled cotton processes. In the future, we are looking at other, let's say, virgin feedstocks, like the example I just gave about recognition and responsible forestry standards that exist for that work on the ground for forest management. So same thing, there may be MMCF quality fibers that could be coming out of biomaterials. So there's a variety of feedstocks that feed into MMCF materials. So we're looking at those different options and opportunities of how we can capture those in the future standard.
Great. So we're going through the last questions. We have little time left. From Team March, at a high level, how will the unified standard support industry needs for traceability and transparency? At a high level, please.
Okay, so first and foremost is that our content claim standard, as well as other areas that we have that either exist today or are in development for traceability, such as the transaction certificate process, D-Track it, E-Track it, all of those systems that we have or are still developing will apply to the unified standard. So those are traceability mechanisms that are there for any of the materials that we have certified in our standards. And then we are also looking at, like what Stephanie had explained for claims and labeling, there is pending legislation that's getting more specific about the type of traceability mechanisms that need to be in place. So we are also paying attention to that pending policy development and looking at how the standard system in the future can make sure to capture those areas as well and be used as a tool for due diligence.
Great. Thank you, Laura. So we are already on the time. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A, but we are going to respond them through the hub. So we want to thank you all for coming here today to the launch of the second draft of Unified Standard. We're going to be sharing the responses in the Q&A and more information to come. And we encourage you to keep on providing feedback through the links we have shared in the chat. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone.